Right, it's 4:02 Australian Eastern Standard Time. Um, I'm going to ask our three guests to turn on their cameras and microphones, and just make a request for everyone else who is joining us, just to keep your microphones on mute for the moment until we have an opportunity to have a conversation with our three guests this afternoon. Um, and as I'm just speaking slowly, there are a few more people coming in, but very soon we'll make a start. But um, I'm going to make the start by just welcoming you all to another event for the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing. This is uh, a periodical event where we have speakers who are visiting us, and other friends who are joining us from various parts of Australia, contributing to the ongoing discussion about Australian literary studies. But before we start formally, I would like to acknowledge that I'm here on the Cairns campus, the Nommabada campus in Cairns, and I'd like to acknowledge the Irriganji people on whose land that we're situated here. And I'd like to acknowledge the unceded land of all First Nations peoples across Australia and across the world. We can add with some of our other friends who are joining us from other parts of the world. So you might like to acknowledge country and which you're situated in the chat, if you like. Uh, but with that, I'm really pleased that I can see the inaugural speaker that we had for the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing has joined us, Professor Philip Mead. And it's kind of apt that we are heading towards the end of our second year, and we have a trio of early career researchers who will be talking to us about um, their their research, their career trajectories, perhaps, but also their idea of what this thing is that we call Australian literary studies. The Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing was established in 2023. We've been going for about 2 years. It's really the celebration, the support, the fostering of reading and writing of Australian literature, and the encouragement of the study of the broad field of Australian literature that is the mission of the Roderick Centre. And when I say the Roderick Centre, the name Colin Roderick lies behind that, and also his wife Margaret Roderick, as well as benefactors of James Cook University. Many of you will know the news of the generous donation that they have made to not only Australian literary studies but to mental health as well. For those of you who don't know, Colin Roderick was the first professor of English literature here at James Cook University in 1965, and he quickly contributed to the literary culture of the North by establishing the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies. Quickly following that on was the establishment of a literary award for the best book published in Australia on an Australian topic, and broadly that idea of the book not just confined to fiction or poetry, but more broadly. So the celebration of Australian writing in general is something that's been fostered with the Foundation of Australian Literary Studies from 1965, then down through to the present day. We're looking at a significant legacy in the study of Australian literature in this place, but also the promotion of Australian literature across the world. And so we're with this support here at James Cook University in Townsville and in Cairns. We've been really lucky to be able to support a number of visitors to this place, for those visitors to conduct the research that it's very important to them, but also to contribute to the research culture here at James Cook University. So it's a pleasure to have visitors come here, and it's a pleasure to introduce our three speakers, a bounty of uh,
Mhm.
scholars in Australian literary studies for this afternoon. I'm going to introduce them very briefly before just asking them to introduce themselves. And so we have, in order of arrival, Keyvan Allahyari, followed by Meg Brayshaw, and then Dashiell Moore. I'm going to ask each of them to, in that order, and it is the order of arrival that we've chosen here, to introduce themselves and also to introduce their relationship to Australian literary studies. And the question that we're posing this afternoon is, how do you understand Australian literature now, which is an echo of Philip's talk from just a bit more than 12 months ago. So how do you understand Australian literature now and your relation to it in the present day, and perhaps even talk about the future? So Keyvan, first off.
Thank you, Roger. Hello, everyone. As Roger said, my name is Keyvan Allahyari. And I'm very pleased to be here today. I spent a week in Townsville. That was the first leg of my fellowship, my JCU fellowship at the Roderick Center. And now I'm in the final week of being on the Cairns campus. Um, I am a junior professor in global literatures at the University of Vienna in Germany. So that's where I am currently. Prior to this, I did various postdoctoral fellowships in Europe and library and critical fellowships in Australia for a few years after my PhD, which I finished in 2019 at the University of Melbourne. I my positioning in Australian literature comes with all degrees of proximity and distance, as this brief history probably told you. I started in Iran when I did a master's dissertation on Australian literature, which was an unusual thing to do at the time, even for my supervisor. Then I had a little stint in New Zealand, and then I arrived at the University of Melbourne, where I did my PhD. So that's me broadly, Raja. Yeah.
Yep. And we'll learn more about Keyvan's current preoccupations, past, present, and future as we go along. So Meg, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Roger. My name's Meg Brayshaw. I'm the John Rowe Lecturer in Australian Literature at the University of Sydney, but currently I'm on the JCU Townsville campus on Bindal Country, beautiful Bindal Country, which is very warm. Every morning I check the weather back in Sydney and then say a little grace for the fact that I'm here. I suppose, I am an early career researcher, but given the fact that I have a job, I have a named position in Australian literature at a Sandstone University. My entire conception of what I do is bound up with this question of what Australian literature is and does, or what it can be and should be, because my vocation and my scholarly identity is Australian literature. And I suppose that in my work, I concentrate on the relationship between literature and environment and politics, and in how I see myself within Australian literary studies. It's about how do we make this field a kind of flourishing ecosystem where, amidst what can often seem quite startlingly horrible conditions, we can have collectivities and collaborations and conversations that are productive and contribute something to our society. And I guess, that's why I'm really happy to be at the Roderick Centre, which I see as one of those sorts of, collectivities for flourishing, and why I'm really, really happy to have conversations like this.
Yeah, it's nice that word flourishing is one that we use quite often up here as well. We would like to think of what we do as an incubator of ideas, but to provide these opportunities for collectivity, as Meg says, is a really good way to put it. And I hope that what we're doing today demonstrates that idea of collectivity, is that we have a group of early career researchers, but early career researchers who have accomplished quite a lot in that early part of their career. And Dashiell Moore is another one of those. Dash, introduce yourself.
Thank you. And very grateful to the Roderick Center and to you, Roger, for all the time and energy that you've put into kind of having us. I'm very thankful of the kind of the community feeling that has built up over the fellowship, and that's no small part to you and the team behind the Roderick Center. So enormous thanks. As the kind of last arrivee to the north, it's kind of like the explorer being told there's always someone further north. And so, in my sense, I'm treading the footsteps of Meg and Keyvan. I thinking about my relationship to a field. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Dashiell Moore. I work at the University of Sydney as a DECRA fellow, and currently in the first stages of a 3-year project thinking about the connections between different islands that have been physically or metaphorically used to contain peoples for incarceration, for quarantine, or just in the interests of kind of imperialism. And that project, I guess, grew out of a sense of proximity to a field, but through and I'm borrowing a term here that I like to think of from Paul Giles, who's talked about the kind of the homegrown tradition of deconstruction in Australian literature, or that innate sense, I suppose, of inversion, dislocation, or projection that can often kind of come with a grounded position in Australian literature. So I guess my research is, I'm interested in thinking about inversion, projection, and how different relationships can appear bifurcated or kind of opposed to one another. In my previous book, I was thinking about how two literary cultures are represented as disparate on the basis of geography or a received understanding of history. And in this kind of current project I'm here for at JCU researching, I'm thinking about more kind of like local environments, islands specifically, that are geographically approximate, but rendered apart, structurally opposed by any number of forces. So yeah, I think that probably amounts to, I guess, an introduction to my research and the kind of comparative way into the field. And as I say, it's not not an unconventional but traditional, I suppose, position within it.
Yeah, and so we're going to ask each of the speakers to talk a little bit about what they're doing up here
Mm.
in North Queensland a little bit later. But I'm going to go backwards. So I'm going to keep you on the spot there, Dash, and just like with each of you, there are these. It's not the same methodologies that you're using.
Mm.
There is a multidisciplinary feeling to your gathering here as three scholar critics. And so the next question that we'd like you to respond to is about multidisciplinarity. So to what extent, you first, Dash, and then we'll go back through reverse order then. To what extent do you draw on different disciplines, and how has that informed your relationship to Australian literary studies?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I've been thinking about this question. Really, I think where I come down to it is like, on what terms are we multidisciplinary? Are those terms imposed? Are they those that kind of arrived with us in the field? And I guess a sense that, historically, multidisciplinary connections have always constituted a field of study in many ways. I did my PhD at the University of Sydney under the supervision of Peter Minter. I was frequently working across decolonial theory, Indigenous studies, island studies, the environmental humanities, and also following the works of people like Elizabeth McMahon, thinkers who could kind of move across disciplines to ask bigger questions, to ask big questions, and trace out connections and between the kind of the context in which meaning is made and how that changes over time. Um, but I guess coming back to the question of terms. I'm often I think what I mean here is that we it's kind of hard to define. I think it's kind of important to stress at the outset to define a field like Australian literature right now is immediately to kind of circle a question of crisis or a kind of a slow car crash, and that kind of multidisciplinarity question. Um, while I consider it kind of immensely integral to myself as a researcher, it's also kind of a function of a kind of a particular kind of employment context, let's say. The working of, of my research around research themes or national interest statements, and so on, just to kind of make that comment from the outset. And that's not to say that this is a determinative thing, really, on what terms do you want to work in a multidisciplinary context? I think by necessity, I think across kind of historiography, island studies, decolonial theory, and literary studies, and then Australian literature, which kind of has, I think, one of the strengths out of this position of precarity, out of these kind of contexts, is its inception at, in theory, in that kind of 1980s, the kind of the high theory kind of watermark. And in the various kind of disciplinary shifts that have taken place since then, which have always been foreshadowed by precarity at any level. So, but maybe I'll kind of stop it there, and maybe I'm happy to kind of come back to that question.
Yeah, that hairy term of the national interest statement comes up, and we should mention, you haven't mentioned, for those of you who haven't read Dash's uh, short bio there, that he is the holder of a DECRA at the University of Sydney, and so that congratulations, Dash, on that. That's an achievement to be celebrated. But that idea of national interest and the multidisciplinarity might be something that we can come back to later. And certainly for everyone who's listening, there are going to be opportunities for you for questions and discussion for you later on, and it'll be good to continue the discussion at that point. But Meg, multidisciplinarity. I should say the special collections librarians who are joining us tonight are overjoyed at the visitors who have been flocking to the library over the last few weeks. And all three of our visitors have been doing that. Meg is the most recent. Can't stay away, I think Meg is the
Yes, I was singing the praises of special collections, which probably signals the fact that somewhere in there I'd need to talk about history and book history and my relationship to those. But I wanted to pick up on something that Dash said about the kind of odd relationship between Australian literary studies and multidisciplinarity, because Australian literary studies has always been disciplinary. It emerged before disciplines as we understand them today existed, and has always kind of been a bit of a strange beast in terms of its disciplinary alignments. And the interesting thing about starting a career as a scholar of Australian literature at this moment is that there is a call to, or there is a need, if one wants to have a viable career, to think about Australian literary studies in some ways as a field that has to communicate with other disciplines and other scales. And I'm always kind of, one of the things that I grapple with is, I want my work and Australian literature more broadly to be recognised for its relevance to the crucial questions of today, what my institution likes to call wicked problems, because I do believe that it is. But I'm also very wary of the need that this might require a kind of utilitarian approach where Australian literature becomes a kind of can be quarried, I guess, or can be a quarry of knowledges that can be exported and used by other disciplinary contexts. So, I work in the environmental humanities, and First Nations literatures feature a lot in that sphere, and sometimes in ways that I think is quite extractive. And I mean, Dash and Keyvan and I were having a conversation yesterday where we sort of talked about the fact that in kind of multidisciplinary spaces, there's, literature is often viewed as an object rather than a methodology that can be used by other disciplines. And Emily Potter, Jennifer Hamilton, and Killian Quigley have written about storyism, the idea that everybody is sort of drawing on narratives and stories, but doing so in a way that sort of disregards that literary studies scholars are ostensibly the experts in stories and narrative. So, I think while the simple answer is, of course, my work is multidisciplinary. I draw on history, I draw on geography, I draw on political ecology, I draw on sociology and anthropology. My relationship to that and how I see Australian literary studies in relation to a push towards consolidation, of which multidisciplinarity, I think, in a cynical view, is part. This idea that we have, less specialization, more kind of horizontal, no need for funding, more schemes, less schemes, that sort of thing. That's vexed, and something that I'm consciously thinking about in what I do.
I was just thinking about so I've referenced Philip Mead already, and I'm thinking about Robert Dixon's work. I was just trying to remember how he was using the word boundary work. There's an article that he's written that sort of captures this. I just pulled up the article with. I was trying to remind myself, boundary work, Australian literary studies in the field of knowledge production. And then I think with all of us, there is this boundary work that we do where we're not that far away from another discipline. So that's a really good representation. The special collections librarians might have been able to identify the different sorts of questions that each of you were asking when you walked in the door, and I think there was some crossover with the materials that you were calling down, but certainly the questions that you're bringing to bear on Australian literary studies might be quite distinct. And so, Keyvan, multidisciplinarity in your work, how does that play out for you?
I write about borders. I mean, if I want to bring my work down to just one word, I'd say it's about borders. For all kinds of preoccupations that I have, and all kinds of movements that I've had within and outside of the discipline and countries that I've inhabited. And the moment that you talk about borders and critical border studies as a field, you open up a can of worms. Just like what Meg was saying, you're dealing with political ecology, you're dealing with the question of the more than human migration, you're dealing with all kinds of questions of infrastructure, of brutalist structures around prevention and discipline, detention, etc., which we have in the contemporary moment. But historically also, they've always been part of the border functions which have made up the world, right? So that's essential to my work. I also agree with Meg that the question of interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity, as you say, is frequently articulated in relation to a compromised futurity. So a series of wicked problems are threatening our futures. And because the disciplines that we have had are going to be ineffective in resolving those problems, we need to come up with more experimental combinations of working together towards those solutions. That's how it is often projected, and the language that through which it is promoted. Certainly, the kinds of funding schemes that I've applied for in the European context, they push you a lot to be very interdisciplinary, and not even that. They want you to be high risk in merging disciplines together. So that's one thing that is emphasized a lot. But with interdisciplinarity, we very quickly we run into the risk of flattening what we know best about what we do, right? And two, the second risk is that some assumptions that are created historically within a certain discipline, in this context, for example, Australian literary studies, cannot travel that easily or meaningfully between disciplines. Concepts that we have in literary studies come with a certain historical baggage, and they make sense to us. And when they're incorporated into other disciplines, and that's something that I have seen, they only convey a kind of a fresh language without really conveying much. A lot of concepts that have been taken up by fields like anthropology and speculative sociology and things like that, those concepts actually come from literary humanities. But by the time they make it there, if you're a literary scholar, if you read work like that, you realize they're kind of incorrect, and they're used in a context that really doesn't really reflect their significance. Some time ago, in fact, I wrote a rebuttal piece to a geographer about the role of experimentation with disciplinary work and bringing all kinds of disciplines together as a way forward out of the impasse of the disciplines. So while I work with my work is interdisciplinary, I'm also cautious about not stretching myself too far, and it's a very, very difficult kind of balance to hold. And then, of course, sometimes I let go and I do something experimental, but I call it an experimentation, and I just leave it at that.
It's interesting. Like we've had this discussion. So Keyvan's studies of borders and crossing borders is interesting, and so each of you I know have are in the classroom, and so the next question that follows up from that is it's like taking Australian literary studies towards other disciplines creates all sorts of challenges, and then taking Australian literary studies into the classroom provides its own challenges. So I'm going to stay with you, Keyvan, and work back the other way now. Like some of us who are teaching Australian literature in the Australian context, I think we'd be interested to know how that's playing out for you in like a not just one but a number of institutions that you've worked in Europe. But also you can draw on your experience in teaching Australian literature in Australia as well. So the question that comes from that is about AustLit and research that you might draw on in the classroom itself. How does research in the field inform your teaching?
Um, um, I teach in Germany, in a German institution. In Germany, you have almost full freedom in teaching whatever you want. So, and part of my contract is to teach 2 seminars a semester. In thinking about what seminars I want to teach, I want to do a combination of a kind of a regional understanding of the world, but also in a kind of in a certain kind of thematic structure. And frequently, I realize Australian literature comes up as a place, as a location of culture, as somewhere that I still inhabit on many different ways. Very quickly, of course, you have a couple of challenges. First, I'm always mindful of the knowledge gap that is created by distance. So you're in the classroom in Europe. Speaking about Australia or engaging students about Australia, I realize always needs a bit more context, something that might be taken for granted, of course, on Australian shores. And then how to relativize that in relation to what's happening on the ground in Europe right around you. Having said that, as I said, it comes up a lot. I work with Australian texts in almost every subject that I teach, and sometimes even talking about other texts comes to me through speaking about Australian context. To give you some of these examples, I have taught subjects on global indigenous literatures, and of course, Australia is a prime example there. I taught a subject on Pacific literatures in context, and it was in fact with a thought that I was going to come and be here in this part of the world during the fellowship, and then subjects in the area of environmental humanities, question of pollution, and so on and so forth. That, of course, regional matters, Australasian matters, of course, are still prominent there. Yeah.
Yeah. And that sort of highlights the title of this in conversation that we're having too: Australian literature, literary history, and the environmental humanities. That we'll touch on that in the latter part of the conversation. But the challenges that we're facing, Keyvan's pointing to that. So that's a bit of a what's happening in the classroom in Europe at the moment. Meg, what's happening in Sydney?
I mean, yeah, the situation in Sydney obviously is quite different. I'm teaching from a sandstone university that's associated with the kind of consolidation of Australian literature as a discipline. But we're also in a time of what I think of as the kind of rationalization of the curriculum, where, for various reasons, there are fewer courses and fewer people to teach them. But I think I'm incredibly lucky in that I get to teach Australian literature in two different ways that I think, while are very different, I try to be optimistic. I see them as both really generative. And the first is where I'm participating in sort of larger survey courses with my colleagues, and notably with my colleagues both in English and creative writing. So one of the delightful things about when I arrived at Sydney is that the discipline of English became the discipline of English and writing, which I loved, because that use of the word "and" suggests those kind of generative connections that I think are so important, and those collaborations. And the classroom, if we think from a positive standpoint, the classroom is increasingly asking us to think collaboratively and work collegially and to pool our knowledges. And, so for last semester, I coordinated a course on contemporary literature. A range of my colleagues participated. I lectured on Indigenous futurisms in a way that sort of I tried to kind of emphasize the significance of this movement in the Australian context, but also tapping into broader questions about contemporary literature, why we read, why we do what we do, what literature does in the world. And I found that a really kind of fantastic, kind of reaffirming way of thinking about Australian literary studies as a discourse that students can get excited about and can make connections to other literatures and other cultural discourses. On the other hand, I am also blessed in that I get to teach an Australian literature specific subject in which I can do whatever I want, which I know is a rarity. So I teach a third year course called Australian Literary Ecologies. My aim in that course is not to give students a history of Australian literature. It's not, I don't take a new historicist approach to it. I sort of, in my interest in space, it's organized spatially. So we kick off with a module called World and Country, Alexis Wright's Carpentaria. And then I do a range of things, the road, as a kind of, crucial chronotype in Australian literature. We look at the Cars That Ate Paris and Samuel Wagon Watson. I think given my time here, my next, I believe that I'll have the opportunity to teach this unit again next year. And I think there will be a module on the tropics, because the literature here is so rich, and the idea of this being a distinct location. And I know from Elizabeth Smythe that Thea Astley cannot be the only person on that course. It has to be someone who's really from the north. But I think, the idea of being in a place and being involved in the literary culture in that place, and whether that's in special collections or talking to people at the Roderick Centre, is kind of something that I want to bring into the classroom, in the way that I've done things like teach Seven Poor Men of Sydney, through getting students to kind of walk and map the parts of the novel that take place on the University of Sydney campus, and to think about whether Stead is actually writing about the real University of Sydney campus, or whether it's a kind of metaphysical environment, in the kind of modernist way that she was thinking of. So that's kind of, I feel quite blessed in that I get to experience those different modes of teaching Australian literature. I get to craft narratives. Often my students haven't done any Australian literature since high school, where I was a high school teacher. I care very much about the curriculum, and the secondary, tertiary nexus, where, the idea of Australian literature might have been quite a circumscribed or sclerotic kind of thing. I'm very conscious of that, and wanting to kind of open up Australian literature as a question and a provocation, that students can participate in creating and thinking through, how it relates to their position in the world, and other literatures.
It's interesting. Just before you all joined, Meg was saying how hot it is in Townsville. And so that embodied nature of being in space, it's like really interesting, the subject that you're talking about, that thinking about the embodiment of just being in various places, and challenging the understanding of that through an engagement with literature of all sorts is really interesting. We'll look forward to the report about how the tropics goes in that subject, Meg. Dash, as a DECRA, you, and I'm not required to do teaching, but I know that you are doing some. And so, how have you drawn on your research in the subjects you've been teaching at the University of Sydney? So, in the same rooms as Meg.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, like Meg, I work at the in the Geo8 at the kind of the sandstone, and subject to the kind of the economic rationalization. I think it's kind of a great kind of way of thinking about this. I think with the DECRA kind of in the backdrop, I thought I'd kind of talk a little bit about the way to the DECRA by way of teaching. I'm currently on a fixed term kind of contract that started this year. Before then, before I finished my PhD in 2021. I think from that year, I started teaching a small kind of, you'd call it a unit of study, but it's a kind of an exchange unit with NYU Sydney. So basically for NYU students who are on exchange in Australia, in Sydney, and they want to learn about Australian literature. And like Keyvan was talking before about how like there's not an immediate background in Australian literature to draw on. For instance, I think we had a week where I had to explain what Hill's hoist was. So, this is essential information. But it was a so it's been a small it was a small unit that ran every semester almost for six or sorry for 3 years or so. But and I complete it was a but it was just the best opportunity to experiment with curricula. It was a six students on average. Sometimes it was two students and me, which was for like 3.5 hours, so it was a long time for them. But they were fantastic. But I was able to make bold choices, I suppose, with the text that I wanted to work on. And it's really that kind of experimentation of aligning texts in different semesters, having the security to think and work through alignments that led kind of really informed the DECRA proposal that I submitted last year. So from I think over the last 3 years, I just oriented in Australian literature consciously to Pacific literature and to New Zealand, but oriented through kind of a similar spatial paradigm, but less focused on kind of, I guess a politics of covering everything. So um, I, I dedicated a week to the coast, a week to islands, to the desert, and those kinds of, I guess, like ecological frameworks. And that led me to think through the dotting of islands across the curricula that, I think once you work on things enough, they have like kind of a gravity. You can't not talk about these things. You kind of, but over the last 3 years, I've, been returning to islands in one way or another, in teaching and now in research. Um, so just to make that point that, I mean, the freedom to experiment with curricula is really what is informing teaching. Sorry, in my current like DECRA research project, and I hope that'll have a kind of a follow-on effect. I currently teach, or I've taught this semester, a unit called Sydney Literary Cultures, which I actually inherited from Meg. It's fantastic, and she did a great job in kind of setting it up. But it's also a great unit for like, broadly, you can kind of make creative choices about how to fit Sydney within kind of a literary sphere. And again, rather than to kind of fit, um, I was conscious, I guess, of the terms by which I was kind of engaging text. So we started with, I think, 2 to 3 weeks on kind of Indigenous narratives and spaces in Sydney, Redfern as a particular block, and the Visitors by Jane Harrison, the play. And that I think informed a focus on, I guess, engaging students in the city that they lived in, that kind of public dimension to teaching, which I think is really essential. It's kind of interfacing with literary events and to kind of places and, themes that, crop up again and again, but also in the terms by which we engage a city. In a general sense, but also kind of the Sydney, which becomes kind of metaphorical as well as like this, like a portable idea of the city that we hold in our heads, as well as the material environment to walk through, to exist in, to find a community in as a student. But maybe I'll leave it there. I'm keen to kind of chat some more.
Yeah, yeah. So just so I'm just looking at the time, and that sort of indicates how long we could talk here. We've got this scheduled time through to 5:30. I've got a few more questions. We're going to talk a little bit about the environmental humanities, and then we'll open it up to questions from everybody else. And the next question might sound like I'm checking up on all three of you, but it is the question of like, what have you been doing? While you've been at JCU, and so I'll go back around again. So Dash, you're on the spot from the beginning. What were the questions that you brought north, and so what have you been doing? What have you been doing in special collections, Dashiell Moore?
Quietly holing up in an office in Townsville or Cairns. No, I've been having a fantastic time. It's been a great community and space to work. The first year of my DECRA, I'm thinking I'm focused on plantations and history of blackbirding. I'm actually looking at Carol Ferrier in the room right now, who I was reading up on your work in just the other day. But so as part of that, I'm thinking about how the representation, historiographical and literary, of blackbirding and plantation labor has been framed by what I call an archipelagic logic, where a given history or event or practice can be at once isolated and expanded to suit the needs of an evolving kind of politic, I suppose. And so, as part of that, I've been engaging several ways. I deep into the kind of the archives of the Jean Giovanni collection, a special collection in Townsville. Um, so there's some fascinating connections there that might be interesting to talk about afterwards. I was able to interview South Sea Islander community representatives in Mackay. I was able to look at kind of records of sugar mills, go out to sugar towns and get a sense of the place, look through kind of archival details around. And again, I'm thankful to the kind of the librarians in the room. Thank you, Louise and Bronwyn, to the kind of the production of sugar or the regulation of the blackbirding trade over time. Those have been the main concerns I think that have been occupying me. And I will give this small spruik. I'm due to give a lecture. I think it's happening next week, but on a kind of the blackbirding in literary history. So I'll be looking at the changing representation of that history in Australian literature from 1870 to the present. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we can spruik that at this time next week. Dashiell Moore will be speaking in much more depth about his research. And over the next probably 6 weeks, we will have scheduled talks from both Meg and Keyvan as well, talking in more depth about what they've done, how this contributes to their research. So keep an eye out on the channels that you follow for information from the Roderick Centre. I think it's gone out now, Dash, a bit of promo for your talk next week. So that's one visitor to Special Collections. Meg Brayshaw, what have you been doing?
I have been having a delightful time in Special Collections and in various small mining communities in the Townsville, Cairns area. So I'm working on a project on the literary history of mining in Australia, and I'm conscious of the fact that Philip Mead is in the room, as is Maggie Nolan, both of whom have done excellent work on this topic. But essentially what I'm concentrating on is how mining settlements have functioned as a really important chronotope in Australian literature for thinking through the relationship between politics and the environment, from the kind of ragtag 1850s goldfields settlement through to the company town. And North Queensland has a particularly rich literary history of mining, and we see a range of different mining settlements come up in its literature and give rise to different literary forms to account for that experience. So, the kind of goldfields exploration, there's some really wacky, wonderful adventure fiction written in the early 1900s. My current obsession and love is a series of novels by Sarah Campion, who was an English writer. She wrote the Mobertican trilogy between 1941 and 1944 that's set in North Queensland, and traces the life of a kind of orphan named for the Burdekin River, who grows up obsessed with gold. And I'm calling it a kind of satiric tragedy, because it's kind of what, if you mash together Henry Handel Richardson and Catherine Susanna Pritchard and Vance Palmer's trilogies of mining trilogies and put them in a blender and added some more weird stuff, you'd get Sarah Campion's Mobertican trilogy. And so the books are quite hard to find. The Special Collections has them here. They also have a lot of Sarah Campion's books that are very hard to find elsewhere. So I've been reading those, and part of what I'm interested in is the relationship between real and imagined geographies. And Sarah Campion wrote about Herberton, wrote about Charters Towers, and interestingly, she wrote about them long after she'd visited them from the underground during the Blitz in London. She was a canteen supervisor and she wrote many of the books through the Blitz. So I'm really interested in how that experience kind of becomes transplanted onto these settlements, which she reanimates at a moment of their flourishing, even though she would have seen them at times of decline. So we've got all of these different kind of geographies and sort of geographies in crisis in different ways layered on one another. So it was really important to me to be able to go to Herberton. I'm going to Charters Towers soon and kind of see. Herberton is really interesting because they've preserved the diggings there. There's a mining museum that is really fascinating and staffed by ex-miners who are very willing to chat. So in that way, it's been really generative and interesting for me to be reading these novels in situ and also sort of thinking about the different geographies, including the real geography that make up their kind of imagined map of mining in the north.
Yeah, the idea of geography is like I'm just going to hold up, oh, and that's not going to show up with this crazy background I've got. I've got a Mo Burdekin on my desk now, thanks to Megan inspiration that you brought here. But thinking about geographies, Keyvan, you've crossed a number of borders on your journey to the north, and that's as you said, a preoccupation of yours. But has your time in situ, as Meg said, has it informed your research? Like what I think you've been to the special collections, but you've certainly spent a bit of time here in the far north Queensland. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
Thank you, Roger. I do share that kind of preoccupation with geography, just this morning I was reading Philippe's essay, Australian Literary Studies Now, and I could see how that was coming through geography and location as prominent questions for the field. My research at the moment is sort of questioning the national as a geographical mode, and there is nothing new to that. But I've been thinking more and more about non-human geographies that are getting closer and closer to us, and the ways that we can articulate a certain kind of literary relationship to them. In coming to North Queensland, I've been thinking about the ways that the non-human geography of pollution, for example, plastic. Think about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, an area which is 3 times larger than the country of France. The ways that we can relate to that, and the ways that we can articulate that as an extension of Australian literary imaginary. So that's a preoccupation. But for me, my current research is about finding a certain kind of historicity of the relationship between water that encircles us and the idea of what I call survivalist imagination in the contemporary moment, but also historically. And by that, I mean this kind of association, certainly in contemporary fiction in Australia, in the region, but also globally, between water and the character of the refugee. It's very common for the kind of fiction that's coming out that is largely associated with environmental humanities to be concerned with the materiality of water, whether it's the flood, it's the rise of water, or it's the drought, right? It's either the overabundance or the lack of it. But immediately with that, you have the character of the refugee, So essentially, you've got a problem with water and you've got refugees everywhere, right? So, so it has become a question for me, where is this coming from? Can we formulate a relationship between the materiality of water, in this case, in the Australian context, of course, is the ocean, and a certain kind of border imaginary that is so ingrained in our thinking about the nation, right? So that's the question that I'm working with. There is a whole series of Australian novels, but also it's not only novels in various genres in Australia and regionally in the Pacific. But you could also translate that across globally to see how that works with novels which are coming from elsewhere.
So that Keyvan referenced the environmental humanities a few times in there, and there's a whole sections of questions that I have about the environmental humanities, but I might ask the audience to help me along with those, so to enable a bit of broader discussion. This is a moment, whether it's a question about environmental humanities, whether it's a question to each of the speakers about like more directly about their research, or just more generally about the state of Australian literary studies and how we might look at it at the present day, but also the feeling of what it's going to be like in a few years' time, with the way that not only the university but the secondary system includes or does not include Australian literature in its curricula. This is an invitation to anybody, and maybe like I'm looking at Philip Mead now, and maybe as the inaugural presenter in this series of seminars, Philip, I might invite you to ask the first question. Unmute yourself, Philip, or I'll do it for you.
No, I've unmuted myself. Okay, so that's a surprise, Roger. But
A good surprise to let everyone know that this wasn't scripted, that Philip isn't here. But please, Phil.
Certainly not scripted. Yeah, look, it's been really fascinating to hear, you guys talking about what you're doing and what you're thinking. That's really terrific, and it's kind of totally impressive in so many ways. And it's wonderful to hear about the the kind of FNQ perspective windows on things that you're providing for us again too. One of the things I did think though was, and I was wondering whether you might have a response to this. I'm not sure about a question, but I was thinking about our current context, and I was thinking about, say, Graham Turner's book about, the state of our universities. And I was on another Zoom meeting yesterday with other colleagues, and that was a sort of hour-long litany about the way in which the humanities are suffering and so on. So you can't help but think about literary studies, or Australian literary studies in that context. And I was thinking also that one of the most, kind of dynamic and important things that's happened in our fields in the last, couple of decades, I suppose, roughly, is the centralization of Indigenous literature in literary studies into our discipline. And that's really important. And that has a kind of cognate aspect to it, which is about knowledge. And I was thinking about, in other words, Indigenous knowledge. And one of the things that we're all, interestingly involved with these days is engaging with the discourse of Indigenous knowledges, which is happening around us in really important and interesting ways. And also, we're in a world where literary studies, literature is suffering from a kind of denigration, from a marginalization, from a lack of interest. And yet, it also has a kind of uncomfortably nationalist, Meg was referring to this, I think, uncomfortably nationalist valency at a time when many scholars in our field were thinking about being world literature people, being transhistorical, being planetary, being global, at the same time as the kind of nationalist aspect of our literature, which many people were trying to kind of escape from, or at least even apologize for, given its provenance in our field, which we know about, which was, you know, kind of sexist and gendered and exclusionary in all sorts of ways. And yet it remains something that we have to think about and to talk about. And the larger category there, I guess, is literary knowledge and what it is and how it functions socially and politically and historically and so on. And I guess that's what the moment feels like to me, is that it's one where there are these considerable tensions and contradictions that we all work within, but that they're also important allies. And one of our strongest allies, I think, is our Indigenous colleagues, our Aboriginal colleagues, and their work. Not just the writers. They're incredibly important, obviously, and not just the critics, the literary scholars, the Indigenous literary scholars, but also the the people working in the Indigenous knowledges area more broadly. That is a whole, I think, forum of allies for us, and that we certainly shouldn't isolate ourselves from that or ignore it or anything. We should, and many of us are involved with that anyway. So I guess I'm thinking how, I guess I'm wondering about how literary studies, Australian literary studies might benefit from these kinds of alliances, which are about literary knowledge, and it's important. And in terms of, you know, even, you know, the ARC framework and research funding and Dash, you know about this, and national statements and that sort of stuff. And you know, Roger's reference to Rob Dixon's paper about boundary works, that was about how to think about literary knowledge. That was an article of Rob's about how to think about the kinds of knowledge frameworks that the ARC was in those days framed by and working with. Now the ARC has lost its kind of coherence in a way, and it's something that which we watch every year to see where their thinking is and where it's going and what the pressures are. And that's something we need to do in relation to how we're thinking about research and research funding in particular. But it's also about knowledge and how we think about our discipline in relation to knowledge. So I guess that's a kind of mess of stuff. But
I've been taking notes, Philip, all the way through, and there's about 15 questions that we can ask of that. But
you can see the overall idea, Roger, is to encourage us, I guess, to think about literary knowledge as something which we're all involved with professionally, and in various ways we're advocates for it. But we're also, whether that's in the classroom or whether it's in ARC committees or whatever it is that we're doing. But it's important in the current moment, I think. Or in Maggie's case, you know, in creating the infrastructure, the data that we all use. That's about knowledge as well. So yeah.
I'm going to direct the question first at Dash more, thinking about Indigenous knowledges, and in a way, I'm thinking of Lionel Fogarty here, Dash. Dash has recently edited a volume of essays on Lionel Fogarty's work, and perhaps there's a response to some of the questions in that work that you've done there, Dash, because it's not just about Lionel, as I understand it, but with Lionel as well, that volume has come about. Is there any way, like there's a lot of things that we can respond to Philip's various
Yeah,
questions.
no.
Is there a way that you would respond?
Yeah, that's actually a really helpful primer. I was thinking about um yeah, those different threads. I kept coming back to a phrase I attribute to Walter Mignolo, the Latin American kind of decolonial theorist, but it might maybe from elsewhere, but like to seek a kind of change in the terms and not just the content of the conversation taking place. It's loosely paraphrased. But I think in the editing of that book and with Philip Morrissey, who was the senior editor of that book, um, I think as much as possible, it was working through the principle of dialogue as much as possible. It evolved. I mean, Philip Morrissey. Sorry, I'm going to have to get a distinction, a distinguish between you and Philip Mead has also contributed. So I'll be kind of in a mess between. But he kind of coins the term of like a Fogarty studies, but which is loosely kind of arrived at with through the formation of a group of people with a kind of a shared focus, but ultimately through dialogue and through the kind of through the community that have evolved through either conversations with Lionel, reading his work over many years, and in the kind of the design, I suppose, of that book, we had regular kind of check-ins and kind of meetings with people who are contributing, and we one of the first the questions we asked in those conversations, but when did you first engage Lionel? What was how did that kind of live context frame the writing of your chapter or for the various kind of points of connection that led to your kind of writing this book. So I guess in the preparation of the book, Lionel and Ali Kobi-Eckermann have a kind of a pivotal chapter at the close of the book, along with Jenny Lian, that bookend and respond to some of the chapters as much as possible, and that at least as it is framed, I then kind of pass it back to the contributors who kind of linked, who kind of referred to it as much as possible. So I guess making that epistemological shift as kind of as not a content or a kind of an accompaniment, a contribution to to a kind of history, but as a kind of a critical or editorial intervention at the point of reading, in which they made for a more networked book. I guess a more like cohesive book, but also that it kind of started with Lionel's voice and kind of exploded out for a different kind of constellation of dialogues and encounters, I suppose. Um, yeah, there's probably more to say there, and Lionel's poetry kind of speaks for itself, its peculiarities and its kind of power. Um, so maybe I'll leave it there.
Yep. So, Meg or Keyvan, do you have any responses to Philip?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a moment now when the topic of literary knowledge is both under siege in terms of its prestige and relevance in broader discourses, but also when we are looking inwards to think what is literary knowledge and what should it do? You know, the method wars have been raging for nearly 2 decades now. And alongside that, we've had these questions about Australian literary studies and its future and its directions. And I mean, to answer the kind of question of literary knowledge at the scale of the nation or the world, um, my response to that has always been that I care about the intersection of literature and politics, and the nation is still an incredibly powerful political form. And that I think literature is one of the ways in which we can imagine other forms. So my investment in thinking of Australian literary studies as a kind of viable ecosystem is about harnessing the capacity of literature to think and produce other forms that are more viable than the settler colonial nation that we exist in today. And I suppose too, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm one of the lucky ones who got a continuing job, but I started my job in the midst of a very serious round of enterprise bargaining agreement at the university. And so while I was thinking these esoteric questions about what it means to be, a lecturer in Australian literature, at a time when we are needing to think through what Australian literature includes and excludes, and what it enables and disables, I was also thinking about these very, very concrete problems of casualization, of Indigenous. Like, one of the things that we struck for was Indigenous employment conditions and parity. So for me, my introduction into the academy was very much about, I was forced to think through the connections between, the status of literary knowledge and the desire to shore up literary knowledge, and how that exists alongside the very concrete battles that we need to fight, within the neoliberal institutional system that we exist in. And to me, those two things are connected and always will be connected. And I agree. That's why, I speak and I think in terms of coalitions and collaborations and conversations with First Nations scholars, with colleagues in other areas, to kind of, in the way that literature does, to create alternative structures and forms. That's what I think we can do. And I think that, COVID showed us that how important kind of on the ground movements are. Black Lives Matter and the importance of those kind of local, grounded, regionally specific, but globally resonant and interconnected kind of, and so that's why I think the scale of the nation still has to be in play, because it's not going away, basically.
Okay, Keyvan, anything to?
Just briefly, yeah, thank you, Philippe, for that question. As it happens, the three of us had a meeting yesterday, and this question of literary knowledge and the location of this knowledge came up, and sort of we talked about the different places that takes shape, and different ways that gets transmitted across, whether it's in the public sphere, from literary prizes to critical work, or the classroom for that matter, or whether it's our research. And of course, I mean, it's dispersed and diffused across all kinds of media. Just briefly, I also have that question, but of course, for the obvious reason that I'm engaged with Australian literature, but based overseas. That's always filtered through that kind of distance. And so my question becomes how to transmit two things. First, how to transmit literary knowledge, if I have it, to non-Australians. And two, what's the relevance of that? What's the significance of that transmission of literary knowledge? Yeah, so yeah, I'll just keep it at those two questions which I have.
All right, that leaves us. So I'm keeping an eye on the time, and we are fast approaching our end point. But we do have some time for like further questions and discussion from anybody else. Thanks for staying with us here on this Wednesday afternoon or evening or morning for those of us who are joining from overseas. Any other questions from other participants joining us? Because I do have a list about environmental humanities if we... Victoria, I think I saw you raise your hand. Yep, virtually and for real.
I'm like, where's the right button? Will I heart you by mistake? But that, I want to heart you too. Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful to listen to. And it's been such a treat to have such deep thinkers and world-class scholars with us here at James Cook University in the North. I apologize if you can hear a chainsaw behind me right now. Hopefully Zoom is just cutting it out. I have a comment quickly, which is just to say how impressive this conversation is in terms of the next generation of Australian literary studies. I think there's always this kind of hysteria of like, it's the end is nigh. And when you hear from, early career researchers at mid-career, when you feel like you were just one yesterday yourself, it really is heartening. And I remember, it must have been 15, 20 years ago, Rob Dixon saying to me, when I was a PhD student, so 20 years ago, like, have you had Wheaties for breakfast or something? And I remember thinking, what are you talking about? But that's what I hear when I hear you guys. I'm just like, wow, your synapses are just firing so fast and you're spending so much time deeply thinking and reading. It's just so impressive. And I'm grateful for that. So that's my comment and my gushing. My question is to return to, I guess, this question of methodology and the provocation that I think I felt in Meg's really insightful comments about Quigley's work on storyism and the risk that story can just be, I'm going to use a gendered word and swear, the bitch of everything else, right? Of all of the other work out there that suddenly like, oh, we'll use story for this, we'll use story for that. I think that is obviously a danger, and it's something that I've discussed in different ways with all three of you around how we put literature in the service of wicked problems. But on the other side of that, as a mid-career researcher who at mid-career has discovered creative practice and is still bumbling my way through that, I have been really struck by Susan Sontag's 1966 essay against interpretation, where she basically charges literary scholars with extractivism in general, in terms of that's what the work of close reading is, right? It is taking the work that creative writers do and making a career of it, or over imputing value to it because of the work that it does in the world. So my question to you is to all three of you, where do you think the balance is struck between, on the one hand, the risk that story becomes the bitch of everything else, and on the other hand, the risk that literary scholars themselves become gatekeepers of literary knowledge or extractive themselves?
That's a very provocative question.
Over to you, Meg.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, oh, you verbalized first, Meg, so you're first off to answer there.
I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, and thinking about these questions, and I guess my general feeling is to kind of push back a little bit on the kind of post-critical, idea of close reading as extractivist model. I'm much more kind of inspired by the idea of close reading as a generative act that works in concert with literary texts, and that criticism can be a constructive and generative force for good in the world that exists alongside, in collaboration with creative works. And that's how I try to see my work, and also how, I did my PhD at the Writing and Society Research Centre at Western Sydney University. My PhD supervisor was Gail Jones. So I was schooled in a kind of understanding that criticism and creativity don't have to, there doesn't need to be friction. In fact, Gail Jones is a perfect example of this in that there's no friction in her work and her worldview between creativity and criticism, and that deep scholarly attention is not extractive because it's value adding. That's kind of how I think about it, and how I hope that I work in my day-to-day life as an academic, in that I'm conscious of the politics of citation. I'm conscious of working with my colleagues in a productive way. I'm conscious of making time to read work by PhD students and to kind of help other emerging writers. So I think while I definitely would push back against the idea of extractivism. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I think it does happen, and I'm very conscious of the fact in the way that I frame my work, in that I need to hit certain benchmarks in my career by publishing in Q1 journals and kind of being recognized through the international algorithmic system of value. But at the same time, I'm very, very invested in this community and in fostering this community. And so I hope that my work and the way that I conduct myself as a scholar, speaks to that. And so yes, I think yeah, that's I really and while I think too, one of the fundamental things for me with the post critique framework is the idea that critique has to exist in a kind of combative relationship with the literary text. And if we go back to Jameson, who is often kind of held up as the straw man of the school of critique, he doesn't, his mode is always about looking for the generative potentials of text as well, that the kind of utopian impulse. And so I think that's how, and as long as that is coupled with a kind of practice in one's day-to-day vocational activities, that is about the community and about supporting this community, then I think we're going to be okay, really. And I think we can continue to be critics in a way that contributes to flourishing and construction. And that's why I think I'm wary of storyism, because I think that's when literature becomes instrumentalized, and that as critics, we are not about instrumentalizing literature. We are about pointing out its own affordances and capacities, and alongside sometimes its limitations. That's how I see the work that I do.
Thanks, Meg. I'm sorry I threw you on the hot seat first, but I really did. I think the question came out of your referencing of Quigley's work, so I felt that maybe you were most prepared to answer it. But I'm really keen to hear if I have the, I don't want to hog anyone else if anyone else is raising their question, but I'd love to hear Keyvan and Dash's answer to that question as well, because we have had these kinds of conversations. And yeah, so I don't know. I'm not going to throw anybody in the hot seat. Who wants to go first?
Absolutely. No, you're spot on. I have a lot of questions about method as well. And I have a lot of questions about the relevance of method in literary studies, especially as I said before, if we take method from literary study elsewhere to another discipline, and whether it does anything effective or meaningful in those areas. Absolutely, I agree with you. I also agree with Meg that I don't have a problem with formalist method. I don't have a problem with close reading as that sort of ultimate methodological output that literary studies has created over the past century. But I am okay. I'm about extraction. I think that research is extractive. All research on some level is extractive. and all research on some level is appropriative. There are various degrees that being extractive is more or less problematic. I mean, so it's not on our level. And there is, of course, a time and a place for rigor and for judiciousness in research, right? So, but there is an institutional context to it that we need to consider. And the institutional context is that the whole institution is laid out on an extractivist model of labor, of contemporary labor, you and I, and also on settler colonial imaginary that is fundamentally appropriative and extractive. For its existence, it needs that. I'm also aware through a lot of close connections around me, I'm also aware of the ways that universities, certainly in Australia, but globally, universities attract capital from overseas through international students. They bring them over and then they subject them to horrendous border politics. People who arrive on student visas and then later they need to apply for asylum, et cetera, simply because Australian government gets rid of postgraduate visas or limits the term and so on. So in those ways, the university gets involved in a broader history of extractivist existence. So on two different levels, it's probably impossible to think of research as fundamentally capable of avoiding extraction, I think.
With 2 minutes left in our time frame, Dash, you're kind of getting by elimination. You're going to get the last word in response here. Do you have any thoughts with just a few minutes left on what's been a really rich discussion this afternoon?
No, I think I don't think I have so much to add in the kind of as far as a closing, other than to say that critical and creative work. I mean, we're at a kind of in a point of precarity. These two kind of forms of praxis, I suppose, I mean, working together by necessity and by the function of a field, by the communities that have defined organizations such as ASIL since its inception. That kind of creative and critical work has always kind of overlapped, and I think we need to be united in supporting that interplay precisely on this question of the diminishment of story to something that is didactic or instructive or that is simply defined by affect and not that it's kind of only that, but that it has these kinds of other wider questions in mind, precisely at the point at which a discipline, a given theoretical contextual history is lost at the point at which a word kind of vanishes or kind of transforms itself as it moves into a new conversation. I'm always interested in these kinds of questions about reinvention, like Keyvan, and perhaps this is precisely where those two roles can balance out in tracing out a kind of an etymological history of concepts as they move between spaces and to kind of work in a united sense with across kind of creative and critical work.
This really feels like it's like part one of a multi-part conversation that we could have here, that we've filled up the 1.5 hours that we've allotted for this time, is a testament to the richness of the scholarship and criticism that our three guests have brought to us. I thank everybody who's contributed to the questions, the tough ones that have been asked this afternoon, and I applaud Megan, Keyvan, and Dashiell for the way that they've responded to those questions. They've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure everybody else. As we've said, this is not the so Dash gets another turn next week. There'll be some promotional material coming there. Megan, Keyvan in August and perhaps early September, we will hear from them as well. And just to add that our final visitor for the year is Michaela Saunders, who will be joining us in September. And so there will be another moment in September for you all to join us for a discussion, a celebration of criticism and creative work throughout the rest of this year. So I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us this afternoon, and for sticking with us at this moment. There is I can see the chat flicking off in the left hand, in my left hand's eye here. So thanks from the crowd. Thanks Meg. Thanks Dash. Thanks Keyvan, and thanks everybody else. Safe travels home if you're traveling home, and I look forward to seeing you all in this space sometime in the future. Thanks very much, everybody.